introducing the vertigrow system of production of plants there. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Kevin. This is the start of a very great thing, in that, I mean, we are going to move, this is the first of a series of lectures about sustainable horticulture and sustainable growing. So look out for the forthcoming lectures. The next one's likely to be in the autumn time. But Kevin will tell you more about that during his talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Patrick. I better make sure that the talk hits the buttons, or else none of you will come to the one autumn, but it wouldn't be with me again. So, first of all, thank you for taking the time out of what is a glorious day. And let's face it, we might not have them next year, so we've got to take them while they're there. But for taking that time out to come and listen to me, talk about not only my project, which is talking about growing sustainable cities. It's an interesting concept to talk about in a rural landscape where we're just about to start a fossil-free farming project with Bicton and Dartington, just down the road here at Parsonage Farm. So why, I'm going to ask you a series of questions that I will hope to answer. Why talk about sustainable cities in a rural setting? What's the link there? I'm going to hopefully answer them as we go along. I want to propose a few new ideas and concepts, and they really come about from me asking my own questions. And I was taught very early on in my education. It was actually at Bicton. I'm a former product of Bicton many years ago, too many to remember. But if you're given an answer, you'll forget it. But if you're asked a question, and then you go away and answer that question, you remember it, you build on it. So I'm going to give you lots of facts and say, don't believe a word I'm telling you. Because if you do, it's gone. That conversation might as well not happen. You might as well go down the pub now and have a drink, and then wake up in the morning and feel, that was a great night out, I socialise. What I want to do is take you a little bit further. And in taking you a little bit further, I want to talk about the plight of where we're at, why I haven't gone out as a curator of plants to collect the last orchid, and why I'm seriously considering taking the project, well, we have taken the project out and supporting cities become sustainable ecosystems. And what's all that about? What's the conflicts that come on? Oh, that's not mine. But this one is. So, you notice subtly I changed the title. The challenge of growing food and providing sustainable ecosystems, because I'm actually a conservationist. I didn't want to get involved in urban agriculture. That's not where I started from, but it's where I've ended going to. Because if you're going to the root of something, by definition it's radical. And what I'm trying to do is say that we have to go back and look at things we've accepted. This is the way that we do it. But then I've gone back to the right title there. So I'm going to do a reflective journey. I'm going to lose my notes for a start because they're getting in the way. I just check you can hear me, and you can hear me at the back. I tend to bounce around a lot, so bear with me there. But I get excited by questions. So why do we have living collections? Why do we even have zoos and botanic gardens in this time of global change? Why did we start farming? What was all that about? Why did we spend the time to do that and spend the energy when we had a lovely life before, just hunter-gathering? And why consider urban agriculture? Isn't there enough land to grow food? And then what is sustainable? Because it's an overused word, and it'd be really nice if we can put some definitions on that by the time you go home tonight, so you can start asking your own questions and gaining your own answers. That's all I'm going to try to do. At the end, I will ask you to walk with awareness, which is what I'm doing on my journey, and I'm here sharing it with you. So in that light, I'm going to say that I hope not to be the first and last of a speaker in this series. That would be a shame. I hope somewhere within the audience you know someone who might be able to come forward and maybe have a different opinion that will help, and propose that with our colleagues at Bicton. Because it's actually about different ways of thinking, and it's having this power of conviction that I'm prepared to stand up and get my head chopped off for saying things that you can think, but you might not come forward and say. But I've done a little bit more than that, because here's the youngest of my 4 children, Luke, who is the new generation, and I accept already that I am institutionally blocked in the way that I think. I'm a product of a scientific training that goes all the way back to the Greeks. And it's very difficult for me to get outside of that mindset. I've tried my damnedest, which is why I've ended up studying at 4 different universities, why I've been studying as long as I've been working, and why I continue to spend my time doing that. trying to get the answer of these questions. And it's for him, and for his generation. So, I asked you one question. Why do we have living collections? I mean, have you ever thought about that? Other than just, oh, I don't like zoos, I don't like botanic gardens, I don't like that crowd. Why do we have them? Look, some people will say they're about amenity, beautification of site. They could be about the education behind something like the Asimina, the American pawpaw. A beautiful plant that comes out at a certain time captures my audience within the zoo and they go, what is that? It's the American pawpaw, beautiful. Or it could be about conservation. And here we have one of my colleagues working on the sorbus, the Devon sorbus, the white beam, of which we now know through modern DNA, it's not one species, it's probably 5, might be even more than that. They're not apomictic either, they do hybridise, we didn't know that before we stuck them all in the nursery row and started propagating, and all of a sudden there's offspring everywhere and they're all different. So we've got lots of hybrids too. Well, here's the reason, and it's that fact of human civilization, that we've got unsustainable use of natural resources, we've got a world that is warming, and we've got a population which is 7 billion going towards 10 billion quite rapidly. And with the world getting richer in terms of using natural assets, including oil, to buy cars, travel, I don't know how you got here, but all of those lifestyle choices that you've taken today to get here, rather than watching television at home, that's what everybody else is aspiring towards. And 10 billion people doing that is pretty scary for me, thinking about the world shrinking, when already E.O. Wilson saying you need 4 planets to live like that. And there's a disconnect growing. We talk in the zoos now about reds and greens, and you can divide an audience up who come to the zoo into those who already get it. It's no point spending any time with them. They're already in that journey. They know a lot about the environment, and probably that's a lot of the people here, to be honest. So I'm actually taking time out to spend it with people who already get it. And so hopefully we've got a conversation going there where we're already starting some way up the ladder. But a lot of my audience at the zoo don't get it at all. They come for a good day out. Their idea of fun is to pick up a stone and throw it at a gorilla. Yeah, and I don't joke. That's really their interaction, because they don't know wildlife. They grow up in urban centres around the country, and their knowledge is at best probably 12 plants. That's it. And those 12 plants, they don't know by common name or Latin name. They just got a name they give them. They're getting in the way. This one gives a sticky residue on top of my car. I have to polish it out. Oh, that must be the sycamore then. You know, you get a different dialogue in this situation. Well, when I came back from Amsterdam Botanic Gardens, where I was a curator out there, where I was actually head of science education and research, I was mindful that really, if I was going to make the most of the opportunity that was before me, I could go out and collect the last orchid and bring it back and put it in a glass house and say, look at me, I know this orchid is, we've saved it, the habitat's gone, but we've still got it within our ex situ collection. Would that be a good use of the resources? I could do it. That's what most curators do. In fact, I hope there's nobody from the zoo here now. I could argue most of my colleagues do. And I do argue, because I wrote a paper called The Ethics of Plant Use in a Zoo, and I challenged all of my colleagues to think very differently about the plant use themes that they could use to optimise the potential for plants in that environment. It includes education, of course. It includes amenity, making the site beautiful. And here's an answer for you: orange. Beautiful in plant world for people is orange. They just like something that makes them smile. And that's enough. But I want to do more than that. I wanted to immerse people so they can get a connection with the animal they've come to see. We talk about sharing the same landscape but not the same space. Because obviously with a tiger you can only do it once. But it sets the scene, so you understand habitat, you understand where the animal comes from and its natural behaviour. And we can do that through plants. In fact, we can improve the welfare. You think about shade and sun, all of these things that happen in our world, and we use urban street trees. We have green roofs, living walls. We have, I don't know if you eat salads, but I've got into something at the moment by James Wan produced called, I have to remember, it's called Exotic Daisy. You eat it and it makes your tongue electric daisy. It makes your tongue go like those old space dusters. It's amazing. I'm growing that in my filter crop like mad, and I'm giving it to the monkeys just to see what happens. And they have fun too, because they're just like us. But that connection is making our keepers really think about these animals in a very different way. So these connections you can make in a space if you choose to. You can go beyond that. You can talk about the culture and heritage of the plants. It was a botanic garden and a zoo from the beginning. So that's an important point to get across. So in that setting, the cultural use of plants in the landscape by people in has these undertones that are positive: caring, cultivation, breeding of crops and animals, all aspects of animal husbandry, really positive in one word. The management and conservation of resources, low. Burrowing, as an example, demonstrates acute husbandry of resources, suggests very positive. If you look in Middle English, it actually meant being a farmer, but you'd only be a farmer if you actually owned a tenancy under the manor royal right. The other husband equals farmer. I have the right to use. It's an interesting one, isn't it? But there's lots of benefits. I'm not knocking this. I'm using that etymology just to help you think through these words, where they come from, their origin, their etymology, but also how we misuse them these days. And it shows you that what has been accepted as the way we do things now has not always been the way. Things change. We adapt. And we give things new names. Very often adapting old names to new ideas. So increased carrying capacity of land, we get more people into small space. Remember what I said before, 4 planets, 7 billion people. Wouldn't have happened if we were still running around the countryside. We'd be knocking each other off when we ran out of food in this area, wouldn't we? We had this beginnings of structure that started with chiefs, someone who basically sat around the table and would agree with the rest of the community what we were going to grow that year, who was going to grow what, who was going to do something else. And that's the beginning of chiefdoms, and that's that idea. And if you think about it, what does economics mean? Well, its root, when you take it all the way back, is home law. It's about sitting around the table and planning for your next year, so that one person can work while somebody else does something else. So this idea of craft specialisation and the birth of civilization begins. And that pretty well, you can chart all the little changes that happen right the way up to the global agricultural revolution. And that begins with fossil fuels. It's a Cornishman, and I'm Cornish, don't hold it against me, who brought something out of a tin mine that was pumping water, put wheels on it, and all of a sudden you've got steam. And rather than have cities which are isolated states, if you like, all of a sudden we can open up the countryside and bring resources from one part to another. And we've never really looked back, have we? We think of crop rotations as being something that's quite modern, but also something that's quite sustainable. It actually met the ends of a problem they had at that time in terms of the way they were looking for more from less. The scientific method began to be used, this approach. Now I'm not talking about the Greek logic here, I'm talking about a hypothesis and then testing it. So it's something different, Newton, that period. The use of fossil fuels, mechanisation, processing, and if you think about it, back in the day, before that period, things like jams, chutneys were the way that you would preserve things through, and here also you have canning processes, tinning. So there are all sorts of other ways of processing and keeping it through the season. We didn't have to rely on fresh quite so much, and we could export. And then we've got the modern agricultural revolution, where we all of a sudden start breeding with wheat that's rather than this high, it lodges or doesn't lodge at this high. You get more into the yield of wheat rather than how much goes into the leaf and the roots. So there's a bit of manipulation going on there, very intensively, but using fossil fuel inputs to help us get there. And here's that model I talked about in terms of the, this is around 1750, it was written up in 1826 and accepted as a model. The city as an isolated state. Around it you've got the market gardens that would take the night soil, the waste from the city, feed them, and food in season would come back in, mostly fresh fruit and vegetables. You have the fuel wood outside of that, which would be used, turned into charcoal. If you think about Burnham Beeches and Windsor Great Park, where I used to work again, that they used to provide charcoal that fueled the bakers' ovens in the middle of London, because we didn't have ovens. If you had lucky enough to have a bit of meat, you take it on a Sunday, hence a Sunday roast, when the baker wasn't baking bread, and ask him if he'd cook it for you. Because we'd usually be feeding on bread and cheese, and the cheese came from the farming district outside, which is where the dairy herds were, and outside of that, up to 100 miles, which is as far as you could get with a grain cart and a horse. The horse wouldn't eat half of it if it's beyond 100 miles, and you'd waste it with pests and diseases. So that was the way they used to be, unless you had an arterial routing, like London. London had a way of getting food in from outside the city. If you don't believe me, Hungry City, it's all in there in terms of Carol Steele's book about our reliance on the rural resource outside to feed a hungry city inside. And that's the concept I want you to work towards. Loads of things came with the Industrial Revolution. But today, If I stand before you as an agriculturalist from the NFU, I'd say goods and services are fantastic. Look at what we provide. Food, fibre, oils and biomass. And we also are paid to look after the biodiversity in our landscapes around. We provide buffers, filters for pollution from these cities which are hungry all the time. We provide landscapes so that we can go out and enjoy in the evenings, drive through. I suggest it's actually this food, the modern food supply chain that gets us food without having to think about it. It's probably one of the greatest successes of civilization. But it's come at a cost, because not everyone enjoys that benefit. And as we sit here, very full, very comfortable, there are 1 billion people who don't have the basic systems they need in the world. So there's a very unfair assessment of what's gone on. But it probably is the greatest success that we've managed to get. Well, look at it now, you go into the supermarket and see what's come from Chile or Portugal. Think of a country, think of a product, and walk around. It's a game I play with the children. And we pretty well find something that fits into either that country or product, which hasn't come from here. In fact, something like 85% of our fresh produce, for instance, doesn't originate in this country. But there are, here you go, 27 countries accounted for 90% of the supply of all food. Again, I'll try to put the facts up there so you can follow that for yourself. It's an independent university think tank that puts this information together, very good if you do want to follow it up. Don't need to read the facts, that's where we are. And the talk I'll make freely available. It's convenient, it's local, however it's not forever, because things are changing. I deal with retail multiples who at the moment are king beyond the producer, and they're already recognising within 4 to 5 years they won't be able to guarantee the food on the shelves that they have now, because the BRICS countries, Brazil, India and China, are far richer than we are. Their diets are changing, and if they want UK meat, they'll pay a premium for it, and our farmers will soon be able to choose whether it stays here, feeds a domestic market, or goes abroad and they make a profit. It's an interesting thing about free market economies, isn't it? But there's been another cost to severing that land around our cities, which is, if you look at the price of food, it tracks pretty well now the price of oil. So they're interrelated. For my students, I use a concept. Think of food now as a bag of green water, which has been fed fossil fuel to get it to you. Because that's pretty well what it is. There's more energy embedded in a can of sweet corn than you get from eating that can of sweet corn. Just the canning process itself. And that's in terms of calories and joules, if you go back to basics.
Kevin, what's the start date on that last one?
Oh,
Sorry.
gosh. Now, I'm on focus there. That's...
Well, what's the span?
Yeah, no, I can't tell you, but what I'll do is I'll send it to you, John, so you know that one. And I can send you that.
Sorry.
Oh, it is there, 2010.
Ah, yes, okay.
Yeah. Lots of people have looked at the flow of materials within a modern farm system and the energy. Essentially, I'm going to sum it down very quickly to you, because I'm going to talk about inputs and I'm going to talk about outputs. And I'm going to call those outputs, well, the inputs energy, and I'm going to call the outputs waste, because effectively that's what they are. One man's waste is another person's raw resource, and that's the way we need to think about it in terms of systems. But at the moment we don't. A lot of what happens with modern agriculture is we cause pollution. So we add, how much fertiliser do we put on a field to get our crops to grow? We look at the table, and we add this, because that's what it tells us to do, which has a percentage more, just in case it rains a lot this side. And that's washed into the rivers and it causes pollution. That happens whether it's organic or inorganic, it doesn't matter. Because we need to make sure that there's enough available resource, and nitrogen's leached, whichever source it comes from, in through the soils into the water courses. It doesn't matter whether it's organic or inorganic, at the end it ends up into our water courses. So you have to think about those products as being maybe a misalignment of the inputs and outputs in our modern agricultural system. I tried to summarise it, so I put these little charts together. I quite like playing with them. So if you think about the hunter-gathering food economy, 200,000 years, that was one way of working. 12,000 years ago it changed up until that period of 1650 to 1850. And within that period, so somewhere around this arc, for over 1,000 years, we've been importing food because we weren't self-sustainable within the UK. And we've always been that way. I'm not suggesting that we can ever get back to being self-sustainable within the UK setting, because we've got 70 million people and only 22 million hectares of land that we want to do everything with. Recreation, ride your bike, feed us. There's a lot going on there. So we're moving towards this. We've got the agricultural revolution here, the modern period with the green genes, the fertiliser, the fossil fuels that are coming in, the pesticides, and now we're moving towards a more sustainable sourcing of our inputs. We're looking to improve our land and water, and we're looking at this model of not three separate cycles of economy, social, society and environment, but interlocking circles for how we need to move things forward. I want to explore a little bit more based around that. Because if we're looking strictly at interlocking, we have to go back to the origin of where our food came from. And the first food was produced within a wall, around a house. Effectively, it was a garden. It was an urban dwelling. No matter how you map it up, it didn't happen outside because it would be taken away. You'd have rampaging animals come in and take it. So think about it, it's within an enclosure with a building, and that's what we call a garden. Look at the definition of a garden. It's a space we cultivate with it adjacent to a house. Usually it's some sort of dwelling. There are some really interesting things going on with urban agriculture in the world outside of this country, which the FOA and the World Bank and the United Nations have acknowledged about the contribution to urban poor by growing food within the cities. There are some problems I want to flag up with that as well, in terms of how we look at that. Well, they can feed themselves where they are, rather than look at a globally secure world, which is what we said for our own economy, for instance, regarding food. I think there's some benefits for us looking at this within our own cultures, and here's some examples from around the world again. East, west, north, south, it doesn't matter. People are trying, because they don't know what else to do, trying to grow food at home. You think about the allotment range over the last 15, 20 years. I think there's something like a 15-year waiting list in Bristol and some areas now for an allotment. So you can't get that. And if you live in a tenement block and all you've got is a windowsill, you're not going to grow all your food that way, are you? So people are looking, they're looking to do something different, but they can't do it using soil because they can't get access to the soil. So they're using pot cultures, they're going on the roof. And I talk with quite a lot of groups who are using pots, pans, anything they can, raised beds to grow vegetables for themselves. It's laudable, but there's a question about that as well I want to come back to and suggest maybe it's another way we can organise it in a much more structured way, going back. Again, one of my models, just looking at, if you think about rural agricultural model, it really has developed around an increasingly secure time. Because you don't put all your assets outside of your village if you think they're going to be taken away by marauding Germans and Celts, do you? That's the way you do it, you protect it. There's an abundant use of natural resources. There's an increase in external inputs to get more yield, growth, this concept, growth all the time, without pulling and recognising the true cost of that. And that results in a growth of rural agriculture. If we look at, because it started in a city and it ended up in the countryside outside and bringing resources back. But if we look at the urban agricultural model, urban agriculture becomes interesting when we have reduced security. Think about Cuba, the oil crisis there. When we have global change, reduced resources, they're less available, they can't be imported in, we can't get those assets like we used to. Reduced inputs, so we have to do things, fend for ourselves. We get this rise in urban agriculture. It's interesting, isn't it? It's a return to the original, but the city isn't for a few of us. We've got now cities being planned with 10 million people in them from day one around the world. There's about 10 of them. Interesting. Not in this country yet, but I guess at some point may well come, depending on the one that want to take it. I said there's another cost here as well. As we increase and go on this growth cycle, depending on the way we do it, but certainly the traditional model has been about reducing the functionality of natural ecosystems. And I raise the question because it's possible, if you take agricultural out of the rural and you free up that land that's currently marginal, to create habitat so I don't have to go and collect the last orchid. So you could see ecosystem restoration going on within urban agriculture. Interestingly, this agriculture is talked about as a rural enterprise, but there's a lot of jobs which are based in cities. If you think about jobs associated with agriculture, they're in the processing, manufacturing, organising, the supply chains. They're not actually about the growing, and for every one farm there's probably about 9 people that stand behind them in the agricultural industry. Certainly aren't attached to the soil, but they live in urban areas. And there are some interesting problems going on, let's face it, and I flagged them up before. This link, it doesn't work, between consumer and producer. You know, the fact that 50% of our waste, our food, goes to waste straight away before we've even attempted to consume it in some areas of our society. There are lots of food issues, and these are the food issues I started with in the zoo. When I came back from 2008, I realised that the volcano was erupting in Iceland, and we weren't able to be guaranteed some of the salad crops that we'd ordered because they were going into different places. And I didn't realise just quite how much an embargo on flying would have on some impacts of our agriculture. It's not strictly true for things like lettuces. There's a lot grown in the UK at different times during the summer, but depending on the seasonality, we rely a lot on imports, both freight from the air but also on the sea. We're vulnerable. We don't have control over what we get. It's very much in the zoo setting linked to what we can get in the shops as a person. There isn't specific food supply chains for zoo animals, so I wanted a bit more control there. But I would suggest the same is here. Remember what I told you about the multiple retail multiples? You can't go down and get everything you want. You get what they want you to have or what they think you want within a limited range. That's going to change as they have less purchasing power abroad to get that range of diversity they have now. We need to fill it in a different way. The quality, well, we know fresh is best, and that's something I'm going to come back to. The quantity, well, if you can grow it, you can reduce the supply chain in the middle, you can have more for less money. And we've proven that in the zoo. We can reduce our food costs, we can reduce our food miles, we're talking food meters in the zoo now, which is an ironic one, and we can be more sustainable. And that's the right thing to do, isn't it? Going back to the ethics question, surely it's the right thing to do. If I go back to the zoo now, let's have a look at what I tried to do there. Because 5 years ago I set out on a journey. I realised that there was this loads of different plant uses I could follow to deliver our mission within the organisation. And one of them was food provision. But as soon as I started asking for land to grow food, my director said, no, need that for the giraffe, need that for the rhino, need that for the elephant. There's always a good reason for not freeing up land, and quite rightly, for the welfare of animals. So the rule is we keep less animals in bigger areas within the zoo setting. And, you know, how am I going to argue with that one? So I tried other ways. Raised beds, I can get quite a few crops that way, especially in no-dig systems. I proposed renting a farm. There's a 40-acre farm up the road I could have got from the council. It's been redundant at the moment. And no, my bosses didn't think I should diversify that much. I think they were worried I'd never come back into the zoo for the meetings. And then I explored protected growing, because we already had nurseries at the top, and working out how much we could do. Then I had a light bulb moment. It actually came, ironically, when the police rang me up and said, we've just done a load of drug busting to Torbay, and we've got all this hydroponic kit. Would you like it? And I went, not really. I can't see, what am I going to do with it? Well, some good compost, loads of lights. Maybe you can use it. I don't use them for the reptiles and things like that. I thought, rang around my colleagues, yeah, sure. But I ended up with 100 lights and ballasts. I ended up with something like 4 van loads of compost and all these pots. And it made me think, well, okay, what is it about hydroponics? So apart from being underground, why is it that these people are using it? And it's the most water use efficient way of growing. You can target the water where it's required. So let's look at, when we talk about sustainability, what are we really talking about? Because even on our land, our rural landscape here, we rely on fossil fuels to drive our tractors, to do our packaging, our processing, and get it to the market. Very different way of thinking, isn't it? So here's hydroponics. That's a really good idea. Let's play with that. Sorry for swearing. There are lots of benefits, and I want to explore them. I'm very open in my thinking. Don't get me wrong, my background was in environmental horticulture. That's my first degree at Nottingham University, and I was a child of the permaculture age. I truly believe that that's the right way to design things. So around each of my exhibits, I produce what I can for the animals, but it's not enough land. And I use that analogy because there's not enough land for 70 million people in the UK. We have to think differently. Here we go, all those benefits. You can read that propaganda from produced by hydroponic people at your will, but I've also put an alternative source on there, people who don't think hydroponics is the right way to go. But now I want to introduce you to a different way of thinking, systems thinking. Thinking about inputs and outputs. Thinking that a problem is really the starting point for resolving and coming up with a better way of doing things. Because that's what really is. Here's how it works. First of all, we've got to understand how the problem comes about. You've got to be prepared to be wrong. I stand here, I don't say everything's right here. I'm still on the journey. You've got to be comfortable in sitting down and arguing that, can we do this a different way? Got to triangulate it, base it down, and then forge ahead once you've made and commit to doing something. And then come back and review it. Plan, do, review. If any of you know environmental management systems, it's the same thing. Here's a site I got, an old elephant paddock, 8 feet thick of concrete. There's no way I was going to put a raised bed on that one and grow everything for the zoo animals. And here's where I ended up. And that was a fortuitous meeting. When I was scrolling around looking at hydroponics, I met a company who were looking at developing the first vertical farm in the UK for the European market. What I didn't realise is they hadn't actually done it. They had a concept, they developed a model, and that's all they could show me. And back in El Paso in Texas, they'd grown algae biofuels, but not very successfully, in envelopes on a conveyor, in a standard industrial conveyor. But I like a challenge, and I suggested to them that what I could do is use my enthusiasm, my experience as a plant physiologist to help them with the science, maybe some of the product development. I could use my staff time, so they wouldn't have those costs. I could do independent research, and I could talk to the zoo, because I haven't had a project yet. Maybe we can afford the envelope, so you can just focus on putting a bit more effort into the technology. What I didn't realise, it was the world's first production vertical farm. Paignton Zoo, really mad, absolutely, when you think about it. What I didn't realise is the science hadn't been done either. So I'd have to end up writing papers, taking primary science, standing in front of my professors at the Controlled Environment Users Group, being called a heretic, a madman, only to get awarded the top horticultural prize in the UK last year. So it sort of comes full circle if you're prepared to stand up by the same people. Actually, it's really funny. I found it. It's in that group. But here we have some just concepts. Horizontal crop. 1 square metre, what are you going to get? 10 plants, maybe 30 if you use hydroponics in a square metre. Well, every time you go up, if you add another layer, you can get more plants per metre square. But I hear you say, what about the light? That's why it's on conveyor, because it takes the plants from the dark side into the light side. And you look at how much light's available at the moment. Plants within a couple of hours of going out into the light, or being exposed to that light, have already started shutting down, because it's too intense. So what we can do on a conveyor is share that out. And here you go, here's the metrics on how many plants per metre squared, 10 in a field crop, single layer hydroponics, 30 plants, 120 I have on my system, and a 6 metre system would have 240. In fact, I've just got that down to 4 metres in a box. Here's the benefits of that. They go through a shower. If you think about traditional glass house or field crop, how much of your area is put over to servicing it? About 30% in a glass house. We only have, well, it's less than 10% of the areas put over to servicing it, because the plants come to you, so you can harvest it. It also, because it's moving within what would otherwise be a static air mass, it breaks down the boundary layer and you have better gas exchange. There's really good reasons when you get into it, you analyse it more and more and more, and you suddenly realise, oh, actually this all makes sense. There is some mad things with it, don't get me wrong, and it's very much the first. So think about it like the first car. You'd love to own the first Mercedes-Benz, wouldn't you? It'd be worth a fortune. You wouldn't want to use it. You'd be walking with a man who'd have to walk in front of you, or a woman, 4 miles an hour with a red flag, just in case it fell to pieces and damaged the horse or whatever else was out there. They're not built for the modern road. And the first, I'm not an engineer. I'm just somebody who asks questions and looks to answer them. And in doing that, we've realised the first vertical farm and proven the science behind all of it. But I'm sure the next generation, my son Luke, will probably end up developing this. And we'll end up with all of the range of transport we have now and all the different ways of growing crops. We just have to believe we can do it differently. The really smart thing about this is this buffer tray, and this allows the water to be cascading through, replenishing water and nutrients, but also allows roots to adapt into 2 different types. Those that are all the time saturated in water and are getting nutrients, and those that are air roots, where you have gas exchange in a humid, over 90% environment. That buffering of the tray allows me to keep a dry top, cooler, hotter, it doesn't matter, because I'm keeping everything tight within the root environment. And we know that roots and shoots are interrelated, but they're very different beasts, and you can influence how much goes on in the shoot by influencing the root. So an example, only 10% of the energy that the plant produces goes into root. It's typically 1-to-1 in a soil. So I get 90% root energy, leaf energy, and that means biomass, and I get 10% in the root. Don't believe me? Come and see it. I'll show you. I wrap it up in a sustainable glass house. We capture the water off the roof. I have photovoltaics on the roof next door that generate the energy to use it. You could argue it's fossil free. I'm not going to go that far. But I give back 8 kilowatts of energy every day that I don't use. Interestingly, and luckily for me, because it could have been a very short exploration with this technology, we delivered crops after 5 weeks. That was all on country file. We've trialled something like 120 different varieties, something like 38 different species of plant. Here's some of those crops. Most of them, there's a caveat here, they're fibrous rooted and they're leafy salad crops. I'm not growing staple foods. That's an important one. But what I am doing is freeing up the land outside that is inefficiently growing those crops and growing them in the middle of the zoo without transport. So usually I'll be packaging water up and bringing it. Something like the average lettuce travels 1,200 miles in the States. That's a figure that you'll see floated around. I'll give you some better figures for the UK, because if you buy a lettuce in the UK in the winter and eat it, you think it's out of season then, isn't it? I'm going to make you feel really guilty. Because if you buy it and it's come from Spain, it's got 1.5 kilograms of carbon embedded in it for every kilo of lettuce you consume. If you eat it from the UK, it's even worse, because of it has to be grown under lights and given supplementary energy, and it's got 1.8 kilograms of carbon. But if you grow it on my system, it's got 0.2. And I've published that data in a peer-reviewed journal. We've had it independently tested. And it uses less energy. So I use less water, I've got less carbon and less energy. Is this sustainable? See where I'm coming from? See where I'm coming from? It's a very different way of thinking. And that's the main thing. I'm cutting out that supply chain in the middle. Because these rural farms are not necessarily giving us the best sustainable route to market for our foods. That's where local comes in very well. There's loads of firsts with it. I haven't gone about that too much, but it makes a difference. That's the important thing. And last year I produced £45,000 worth of crop off of 85 square metres of space. You can grow 11,200 plants, and I can grow somewhere between 12 and 18 crops around the season. I choose to grow longer. We're actually down to 9 crops in terms of crop cycles. The reason being, I don't use supplementary light, and I don't use supplementary heat, because the inputs and outputs wouldn't work. And I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to be a heretic. What I want to do is try to think differently about how we can grow crops. But I'm telling you all this stuff. That's in the zoo. I've done a lot of work there. We've talked about it. But is there a future beyond zoo? And you see, if you Google vertical farming, you come up with the most ridiculous cartoon rendered images of what the future might look like. For me, that's not it. If you think about it, who on earth is going to turn over a really highly profitable central building in the middle of a city to grow lettuces? Not 33 pence per plant in the wholesale market. It isn't going to happen. There's lots of people trying to grow it on our roofs, isn't there, out there? You only have to go and see. I was up in Wigan yesterday at a university technology college. They've got a vertical farm. They're trying to realise the green roofs are all filled up. They've got living walls. They're trying it. They're trying it. Can we have a sustainable urban agriculture? Let's change this, because this was something that BBSRC put out about a sustainable, working towards a sustainable rural agriculture. Well, I've suggested some models, haven't I, about zoning. I think the urban environment can grow certain foods and do it more sustainably than we currently do in our rural enterprises. If you think about the benefits of an urban area, we know we've got the heat island effect. Cities are usually 5 degrees warmer than the surrounding area outside. Why pump heat into a glass house in the rural area when you've got that energy being wasted and causing problems for us globally in our urban areas? Makes sense to use it. Why not capture the rainwater off the roof and convert it into food? Go a stage further. Why not use the sewage that we produce and turn it into heat and power to generate those systems through anaerobic digestion in the winter? All of those things I'm now looking at. But I still think there will be a need for local and regional. I'm not saying that we should change the countryside. Maybe just interlink it a bit more. we still need the soil to grow our staple foods. We still need to manage the fertility, but we also need to look at ecosystem service benefits in those landscapes. In the UK, in fact the Americans laugh at us, because when we talk about local, for them the UK would be a local place. This is not as even big as one of their counties. But that, I mean, that's the sort of scale difference you're looking on when you go into global markets. You've got to be very careful about talking about local when you go across the other side of the Atlantic. But if I say national now, we nationally are very well adapted to grow grass. You wouldn't believe it now with this summer, but usually we're wet, especially on the west, and we produce meat. And that's always been the thing we've been told in agricultural colleges, that we should be producing more of. But we can also, as we look forward, grow a whole range of other crops. We can look at our landscapes as agroforestry rather than just going back to what we're taught is how agriculture is, single crops in single fields. It doesn't have to be that way. There's lots of different ways of looking at our national. And there will always be a need to bring in international crops. I'm not saying that we can be completely self-sufficient, not unless you're prepared to get rid of half the population. I'm not for it if you are. Yeah, it'd be a difficult task. Some people call this radical. I'm not only joking, don't please. But there's some benefit. There are some benefits to this approach. Now look at me logically. Reduce food loss and waste if it's consumed and produced locally. We can see the people that are growing it. Community farms in urban areas are a real possibility. Local markets. Reduced resource means increased market volatility and increased costs. So we should be making the most of our own land and the security that we can within our country, shouldn't we? We could align consumption better to production. That makes sense, especially when we've got these BRICS countries who will take our excess, will pay more for a premium because they want more red meat, and they're prepared to pay British because that's what they've always been told is the best. We live in a crazy world at the moment. But we can tie that up through some sort of mechanism within the UK, so it stays within the UK if that's what we choose to do. There are policies and structures in place. Think about the cap. 40% of our taxes go to agriculture in the EU status. That's a hell of a lot of money, isn't it? Much more than goes into education, as an example, or healthcare. And sustainable land management requires, or can provide, ecosystem service benefits. If I look back in my urban landscape, there's some problems for me here, because over the last 20 years, we've been pushing this green infrastructure. I talked about living roofs, green walls. The value of grass is now being recognised for how it locks up the water locally rather than allows it to be pushed out through hard surfaces into our rivers, causing problems further downstream as we wash away the sides of the banks and the soils of our field and have our estuaries filling that. There's the concept of rain gardens coming across from the States and Canada, again about retaining them and enjoying the beauty of a wetland landscape within our open areas. And we've got nature corridors. This all requires the same land mass that people are out there trying to grow food on at the moment in our cities. You can check up on Urban Inform about how this is being promoted as a good way of making our cities more sustainable ecosystems. But that contradicts, or this comes as a legacy of 50 years now of nature conservation in our cities. This was a great piece of work in terms of summarising work going on by BTCB and the Trust for Urban Ecology in London about how ecosystem benefits are being provided now in the city after 50 years of trying to do it. They're measuring it. It's really successful. And all of a sudden you've got people like me coming along saying it's a good place to grow food. Look what's happened to our countryside where we've grown food and not done it sustainably. We're now paying to put wildlife back in, or trying to retain it that way. There's also some problems based around some of the approaches taken with urban agriculture, which is when people try to grow in plastic pots, do they really know what's going on with those plastics? For instance, there's only two plastics which we know at the moment don't know. There's only two types of plastics, number one and number two, if you look on the bottom of the recycle system, that don't give you problems related to cancer or endocrine disruptors if you use them for growing food. But people use all sorts of vessels, all sorts of plastic vessels for growing food. Think about it, when you put a compost, organic matter, humic acids, water, rainwater, slightly acid, and you've got chemistry going on in a plastic bucket with endocrine disruptors and carcinogens. It's an interesting mix, isn't it? Do you know the fact is there isn't any science out there to tell you how that works in horticulture, but there's loads of it telling if you drink water from these bottles, what it happens to your body. Again, don't believe me, go and look up some of the references I put there. Go even further. What compost are we putting on? There was some really interesting work done on the British Standards PAS 100 standard for municipal waste that was composted. And that's exactly what's in it. When they started growing tomatoes at Stockbridge Technology Centre, they realised there was all sorts of different products going on. Some were growing really tall, others had dwarfs and mutations going on. And what was happening were people cut their grass, but they don't wait 2 weeks for the herbicide they put on to kill the dandelions to go before they put it into the municipal waste. And that comes through into food chains. So if you buy one of those nice bags of municipal compost, zoo poo, no, not from zoo poo, but something like that, you could actually be importing pesticides. And in fact, I think 90% of the samples were contaminated.
Oh.
You can see the research, it's independent research was carried out. And then there's this concept, this is where I want you to follow it up with food chain transfer, because it's not just pesticides. I worked in Amsterdam Botanic Gardens and we had lots of plants that wouldn't grow from lots of different families. And I did the first soil analysis in 380 years they'd ever had there. And when I did it, it was terrible. Half of the soils, more than half of the soils, were toxic because they've been bringing in organic matter every year. They'd used sleepers to retain walls, and they'd arsenic leach from the sleepers, and the amount of phosphates that had built up in the soils that made them toxic. So you had phosphorus outcompeting other nutrients. No wonder plants wouldn't grow. You've got to be really careful. How many people routinely take soil analysis and leaf tissue analysis to know what's going on in the plant? Bioaccumulation is a problem. The Americans have recognised it, and now they produce all sorts of guidance on urban growing about bioaccumulation within the urban environment. My old professor, Colin Black from Nottingham University, has travelled the world looking at this problem. And he's realised pretty well every city, where we're encouraging people to get involved in urban agriculture using soil, has ended up with us polluting the population with heavy metals. Really interesting one, isn't it? So yes, I do think we can zone our agriculture, but we've got to be careful about the way we do it. I'm not suggesting you grow in plastic boxes. I'm not going to do that. I think we benefit from the heat island effect. I told you that's a really good way of growing those crops which would otherwise require heat and power to get them optimally growing. We can also capture the rainwater that falls naturally on the roofs. But I think we have to be a little bit careful and make sure that we don't undo 50 years of bringing wildlife into our urban centres, so we end up with sustainable urban agriculture alongside sustainable urban ecology in our city centres. Here's some of that integrated technology. It's interesting how you can tie all things up, and that you think the next generation, we're talking here about setting up a new farming college. It doesn't have to be about tilling the soil. Farming can be so much more than that these days, because there's room for everyone to bring some benefit towards a new sustainable version of how we grow food. This one was meant to be in a rainy summer, I'm sorry. Okay. And then going out, because I wanted to link this back with other talks that you might find in the series. I've talked about the urban. That is not going to produce all of the food that we need. And I think looking at our native landscape as it's adopted, it wasn't a closed canopy of woodland when we walked off the beaches and started farming it. We had a lot of animals that were already there. We had aurochs, the forerunners to our cattle. We had Przewalski horses or something like that, Exmoor ponies, Dartmoor ponies. We had elks or the deer. We had the wild boar. All of these animals were creating glades in our woodlands, which is what we naturally started cultivating in our shifting base and then made those a permanent place. There's a lot of work been done in the Netherlands on the Oostvaarderbladden, an area of reclaimed land where they put the right mix of animals back and they found a great abundance of wildlife spontaneously erupted over a 25-year period. Spontaneously, 25. A stretch, but in terms of the geology of what I've been talking about, that's pretty damn good, I think. So, going further, I'm not resting on hydroponics with nutrients. What we've been working with is also providing fertility in a more sustainable way. I want to provide protein in our cities, and fish provide protein. Their waste provides the nutrients through biofiltration that plants can use. And that's what we've been working on for the last 2 years. I'm going to say this technology is about 5 to 10 years off where it needs to be to get to a sustainable base. But someone has to do the research, and there isn't anyone in the UK university doing that at the moment, apart from collaborators I'm working with at Plymouth University. Sterling stopped their programme, Charlie Price came out, he's working as a social entrepreneur, and it's Plymouth that are keeping that research going, and that's something again which I would hope could come to Bicton at Dartington, because it is one of the future things. And 5 years in a landscape that I've just talked you through over 12,000 isn't a big investment, is it? To come up with a new sustainable way of providing fertility for some of our crops that we can grow in these urban areas. That was my reflection. I want you to think deeply about what I've said today. Not come back to me with answers about, well, of course you can do this, you can do that. Yes, I could, but actually these things need to be shared. This is where community begins, by asking questions, answering them, and having a good debate about the right way to go forward. I haven't got all the answers. I've just got some of the solutions. Thank you very much.
Kevin, on behalf of the audience, I want to thank you. You raised a lot of questions and answered a lot. You also gave us a lot more to think about than just the urban agriculture and everything else that impacts upon our lives as well. Thank you again. Kevin would like, if anyone's got any questions for Kevin, or anyone wants to open a discussion forum, you can do. Yes, Liam.
Just wondered what food do you use, or what feed nutrients do you use in the hydro?
Okay.
Yeah.
When I'll repeat it because it's being recorded as well. So the question was about what feed am I using in the current system. When I first started, remember I was trying to do two things. It was a public education exhibit, and it was also a research centre. And when you're researching, you have to look at what industry is currently doing. So we set off with an industry standard, a named variety of lettuce, and a nutrient solution that comes as a proprietary feed. We've now moved beyond that. So we started growing in peat modules. That's the only peat I've ever used in the last 10 years of me working. Very quickly I got rid of it because the industry was telling me we have to grow in peat. It's the only thing we can do with the hydroponics. Absolutely over the tosh. Within 3 months I was outperforming using a coir medium. And we've stuck with coir, it's pretty inert, but I've also tried hydrolica, sand, and the route that I'm preferring to go towards is cellulose, which is if you've got a tree and you take away the lignin, that's the brown part, you're left with the white part, we usually call it paper, and that you can actually grow in that. And then I can feed the shoots in to the public side in the restaurant as well as the animals, but the roots and the cellulose to the animals. So I have no waste. And that's what I've been trying to get towards. And we've done some very successful trials over the last 18 months with that. But it's getting it in a stable format which can be mass produced. And that's all the time when you're talking to commercial people. It's okay, I can say we can do it, but they want to say, can you do 1 million? It's a bit difficult. I've got somebody there packaging them into little widgets. You know. So, I mean, again, I'm working with the industry to try to say this is a good medium to work with. We've done the same thing with lights. I don't have lights in that system at all. What I didn't tell you is I've got exactly the same system in a warehouse. Because there is a problem with glass. I don't think glass is the best way to grow in the UK. 6 months of the year you're heating it, 6 months of the year you're cooling it if you're looking for optimum performance. If you take away the problems that you get with natural daylight, and then you look at a cave, but take away the water, you've got a really stable environment. And then you look at the inputs, and if I said that every light that you use in the industry gives off heat, if I can marry the light and the heat in the right way, has that got better energy conservation than using ventilation or heat or light in a conventional glass house? The answer is yes. And I'm doing that work at the moment. I'm doing it for Birdseye, interestingly. They paid me £100,000 to do it. I'm not allowed to share the results. I shouldn't have even told you who it was. But no, seriously, I can talk about it now. But at the end of the year, they are going to let me publish that data as well, because they're not looking to become growers. They just want to help inform the next generation of growers and their own growers and suppliers. At the moment, they're buying from Chile, they're buying from Italy. The food miles are astronomical, and they're also losing out now, and they're looking to buy, and they want to buy it here, do it here, and they've realised, again, from a talk I gave up in London, that if they can do this, but in a packing house, in a distribution centre, on the outside of a city, Why wouldn't you want to do that? Just feed it into their supply chains. There's some real logic there, isn't there? And they're taking me at my word, so we'll see.
So you didn't answer the question there. Are you moving away from the proprietary?
Yes, yeah.
brand,
But it's going to take
feed?
5 years because we've got aquaponics research going on there at the moment, and it's really difficult to get the. You can get. We've shown we can get a protein conversion ratio of 1 to 1.2, feeding off worms and feeding off a proprietary feed. So we can get the same similarities there, but there's some nutrients missing. It's actually seaweed, calcium and iron you have to put back in an aquaponic system. But doing that in a stable way where you don't cause problems for the welfare of the fish, in a system where you're taking that, you've got the intensity of the fish rapidly growing, feeding into a plant-based system which is taking the nutrients off, coinciding it. Those cycles are on 4 weeks, those cycles are on 9 months to a year. That's where it's really hard to, if you do it on a small scale, we've done it, but to do it on a commercial scale, where you've got vats of these things going in tons.
In the States, they're
yeah,
doing
no, absolutely.
really well.
I'm working. I've got a student from America at the moment working with us, so I'm familiar with those models. Been out to see them, but they don't work in a temperate climate. We're not going to use tilapia. Why would I heat water to 25 degrees? What I want to do is use cold water fish, and I want to use mirror carp. Well, we're not quite ready for carp yet. Polar shark is a good fish. I want to use tench. I want to try to get to trout, but then your density is lower, and I need 50 tonnes to make it commercially successfully. That's what the market's telling me, 50 tonnes. And I need 4 times then that for leaf produce. I haven't got a big enough system to show them a commercial model. That's where I am struggling, because I need to get to that scale. You never know, might be able to do it here. Maybe. It's difficult.
I was going to say that my background is, first of all, an engineer in the wastewater industry, but currently working as an asset manager. And I have 2 questions related to that. First of all, you've already made mention of sewage sludge, using human sewage. I believe it is a worthwhile product to use and has a lot going for it. There is not to be human appetite for its use, though, for various reasons, despite the fact in the olden days, as you already said, night soil and so forth used to be distributed to the soil, still goes on today to some extent, but in a much safer manner. So that's the first question, you know, are you investigating anything in terms of the use of sewage sludge? And the second thing is you have, with your glass house system and rotating system, an asset that has a fixed life, and that's depreciating, its asset life. You know, have you taken that into account in your type of calculations in terms of depreciation?
I should have given you the figures on that one actually, because if you bought that system, and I'm only talking that system, there are multiple other different versions being worked up at the moment. That system, £350,000 investment from start, will allow you to have a return on investment in 23 months with a profit of £125,000 a year thereafter, if you're growing basil.
I'd like to see that return.
We did that. I'll tell you who I did that work for. Is actually for South West Water. And we were looking at taking in Totnes, looking at taking sewage off of Totnes